Some places don't call for help. They wait for the right soul to listen. The morning air over Blackridge Lake felt colder than it should have for early fall. The kind of chill that didn't just touch the skin, but settled somewhere deeper, somewhere harder to explain. And Daniel Hayes noticed at the moment he stepped out of his old pickup truck, boots pressing into the damp gravel with a slow, measured weight that came from years of walking places most men never returned from, while beside him, Rex, his 6-year-old German shepherd, stood unusually still, ears lifted high, amber eyes locked on the distant stretch of water as if the lake itself had spoken his name, though there was no wind to carry a voice and no ripple across the surface to suggest movement. Just a wide sheet of gray glass reflecting a sky that hadn't quite decided whether it wanted to be morning yet. And Daniel exhaled slowly, watching his breath drift in the cold air as he adjusted the strap of the worn canvas bag slung over his shoulder, the familiar routine grounding him in a place that suddenly didn't feel familiar at all, because Rex wasn't moving, and that alone was enough to set something uneasy turning beneath Daniel's ribs, since the dog had been trained to react, to scan, to move with purpose, not freeze like this, not stand there as if listening to something too far beneath human hearing. And then, without warning, the tension snapped as Rex lunged forward, the leash jerking hard in Daniel's hand, pulling him off balance just enough to force a step forward. Then, another, boots scraping against gravel as the dog surged toward the narrow trail that led down to the water's edge, and Daniel tightened his grip, instinct kicking in before thought had time to catch up. "Easy, boy," he muttered, voice low and steady, the same tone he'd used in places where calm meant survival. But Rex didn't slow, didn't even hesitate, just kept pulling with a focused urgency that Daniel had only ever seen a handful of times before, moments when something unseen demanded attention, moments that usually ended with a discovery no one else wanted to make, and that memory pressed quietly against the edges of his mind as he allowed himself to be led, not because he trusted the lake, but because he trusted the dog, always had, even when it meant walking towards something he couldn't yet understand. And the trail sloped downward through a thin line of trees, their leaves barely moving, their silence heavier than it should have been. No birds calling, no insects humming, just the faint crunch of Daniel's boots and the steady pull of Rex guiding him forward, step by step, until the shoreline came into view. And something about it felt wrong in a way that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with absence, as if the world had simply forgotten to continue there. And Rex slowed, but didn't stop, his body low, muscles tense, eyes fixed on a single point near the edge of the water where the surface seemed just slightly different, not moving, not shifting, just waiting. And Daniel felt it then, that quiet, unexplainable weight settling over his chest, the kind that didn't come from fear, but from recognition, like standing in a place you'd never been before and somehow knowing you weren't supposed to find it. And still, he followed. Daniel did not speak as he stepped closer to the water, because something in the stillness demanded silence, the kind of silence that felt older than the trees behind him, older than the narrow trail that had led them there. And Rex seemed to understand that without being told, his movements slowing into careful, deliberate steps as if each inch mattered, as if the ground itself held a memory he did not want to disturb too quickly. And when they reached the edge, Daniel stopped, boots sinking slightly into the damp earth, his gaze settling on the surface of the lake where Rex had been staring. And at first he saw nothing, just a faint reflection of gray sky and the thin outline of distant branches. But then, as he narrowed his eyes, something shifted in the way the light touched the water, not a ripple, not a wave, but a subtle distortion, like glass that had been imperfectly set, and his breath slowed, instincts sharpening in a way he had not felt in years, because this was not curiosity anymore. This was recognition without understanding, the kind that made the back of his neck tighten before his mind could explain why. And beside him Rex let out a low sound, not a growl, not quite, something softer but deeper, a vibration that seemed to come from instinct rather than emotion. And Daniel crouched slowly, one hand resting on his knee as the other reached forward, hovering just inches above the water, hesitating there, as if waiting for permission he knew would not come. And the cold rose up from the lake before his fingers even touched it, a sharp, unnatural chill that felt out of place for a body of water that had seen weeks of mild weather. And when he finally let his fingertips break the surface, the reaction was immediate, not from the water, but from the feeling beneath it, a faint tremor that pulsed through his skin and into his palm, steady and measured, like something keeping time far below, and Daniel pulled his hand back instinctively, heart tightening as a memory brushed against him, distant but familiar. Something about patterns, about counting, about listening for signs in places where no sound should exist, and Rex stepped forward then, placing one paw at the very edge, leaning slightly as if drawn closer by something unseen, his ears angled forward with sharp precision, and Daniel watched him carefully, because this was not fear in the dog, it was focus, the same focus he had seen in moments when Rex had been certain, when hesitation would have meant missing something that mattered, and that certainty pressed against Daniel's hesitation, pushing him forward despite the quiet warning forming in his chest, and he leaned in again, this time shifting his position to look more directly into the water, adjusting his stance so the light fell at a different angle. And that was when he saw it, not clearly, not all at once, but enough to know it was there, a shape beneath the surface that did not belong to nature, straight lines where there should have been none, a dark outline buried just deep enough to remain hidden from casual eyes. And for a long moment he said nothing, because there was no simple explanation for something like that, not here, not in a place that felt as untouched as this. And Rex let out 3 short, controlled sounds, barely louder than breath, the same pattern Daniel had learned to trust long ago, and something inside him settled into place with quiet certainty, because whatever lay beneath that water was not random, it was waiting, and somehow, without knowing how or why, it had been waiting for him. Daniel did not move for several seconds after Rex gave the signal, because that pattern was not something the dog used lightly, not something he repeated without reason, and the weight of it settled into Daniel's chest with a quiet certainty that felt both familiar and unwelcome, like a memory returning without invitation, and he shifted his stance slightly, eyes never leaving the shape beneath the water as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing, the straight edges becoming clearer the longer he looked, lines too precise to belong to nature, too deliberate to be dismissed as debris, and the longer he studied it, the more the unease deepened, not because of what it was, but because of what it suggested, something placed here, not lost, not forgotten by accident, but left with intention, and that thought alone made the air feel heavier around him, as if the lake itself held its breath, waiting for him to understand something he was not ready to face, and Rex stepped forward. Again, lowering his head closer to the surface, nostrils flaring slightly as if scent could travel through water, his focus unbroken, unwavering, and Daniel followed that gaze, adjusting his position once more, leaning slightly to the left until the light shifted just enough to reveal more of the outline below, and this time the detail came sharper, a corner, a flat plane, something metallic perhaps, dulled by time but still intact, and a faint memory flickered at the edge of his thoughts. Something about structures designed to remain unseen, about placements chosen carefully, always near water, always just beyond reach, and he inhaled slowly, steadying himself as that feeling of recognition grew stronger, because this was not just unfamiliar territory, it was something connected to a part of his life he had spent years trying to leave behind, and Rex let out another low sound, softer this time, almost questioning, as if asking whether Daniel was ready to acknowledge what stood in front of him, and Daniel reached down, picking up a small stone from the shore, turning it once in his fingers before tossing it gently toward the spot where the distortion lay, and the stone broke the surface with a soft sound, sending ripples outward in slow, widening circles. But as those ripples passed over the shape, something unexpected happened. The pattern beneath did not disappear or blur as it should have. It held steady, unchanged, as if it existed on a different layer entirely, untouched by the movement above, and Daniel felt his breath catch slightly at that, not in fear, but in realization, because whatever was down there was not simply resting beneath the water, it was sealed, protected, or perhaps preserved, and that thought settled into him with a quiet finality. And for a moment he closed his eyes, not to escape, but to listen, because that faint pulse he had felt earlier was still there, barely noticeable, steady and precise, and as he focused on it, counting without thinking. The rhythm aligned with something buried deep in his memory, something from long nights spent waiting, listening for signals beneath layers of debris and silence. And when he opened his eyes again, the lake no longer felt like a place he had stumbled upon. It felt like a message, one that had been waiting far longer than he wanted to admit, and Rex stepped back slightly then, turning his head just enough to look at Daniel, not confused, not afraid, but certain, as if the next step did not belong to instinct anymore, but to choice. And Daniel understood that without needing words, because whatever lay beneath that water was no longer just a mystery. It was a question directed at him, and whether he answered it or walked away would change something he had not yet fully grasped, but could already feel beginning to shift. Daniel remained still only a moment longer before the decision settled into him with the same quiet inevitability he had learned to trust in another life, not because it felt safe, but because ignoring it felt impossible, and he exhaled slowly, eyes fixed on the shape beneath the water as his mind began shifting from uncertainty into method, the old habits returning not as memories but as instinct, each movement deliberate, each breath measured. And he stepped back from the shoreline just enough to scan the surrounding ground, taking in details he had overlooked before, the slight depression in the earth a few feet to the right, the way the grass grew unevenly along the bank, and most of all, the absence of natural clutter where there should have been driftwood or debris, as if something had once disturbed the area and left it too clean in its wake. And Rex followed his movement without hesitation, circling once before stopping again near the exact point he had first indicated, his posture firm, alert, but not tense, as if whatever lay beneath the surface was not a threat, but a truth waiting to be uncovered. And Daniel crouched again, this time shifting his attention away from the water itself and toward the shoreline, fingers brushing across the damp soil, pressing lightly as he moved along the edge, searching for something unseen but expected. And after a few seconds his hand paused, feeling a difference beneath the surface, not stone, not root, but something flatter, more uniform, and he cleared away a thin layer of dirt with careful movements, revealing a narrow strip of metal partially buried just above the waterline, its surface worn but unmistakably shaped by design. And his chest tightened slightly as recognition deepened, because this was no accident, no natural formation shaped by time. It was constructed, positioned with intention, hidden just well enough to escape notice, but not completely erased. And Rex stepped closer, lowering his head beside Daniel's hand, watching as if confirming what he already knew. And Daniel traced the edge of the metal with his fingers, following its line until it disappeared beneath the water, connecting the shoreline to whatever lay below. And that connection was enough to shift everything in his understanding, because this was not simply something submerged, it was anchored, linked, part of a larger structure concealed beneath the lake. And a memory surfaced then, clearer this time, not fragmented but whole, instructions spoken in calm, measured tones about installations designed to remain unseen, about access points hidden at the edge of water to protect what lay beneath. And Daniel closed his eyes briefly, not in fear, but in acknowledgement, because he knew this design, not from rumor, but from experience. And when he opened them again, the lake no longer felt distant or unfamiliar. It felt connected to him in a way he could not ignore. And Rex shifted his weight slightly, stepping back just enough to give Daniel space, his ears still forward, his gaze steady, as if the next step belonged entirely to the man now. And Daniel reached toward the metal strip once more, brushing away the last layer of dirt to reveal a faint seam running along its length, a line so subtle it could have been missed entirely without knowing what to look for. And as his fingers followed that seam, the faint pulse returned, stronger now, not through the water this time, but through the ground itself, a steady rhythm that echoed upward through his hand. And he stilled at once, breath catching slightly as the realization settled fully into place, because this was not just a structure, it was active in some way, not loud, not obvious, but alive with a quiet persistence that had endured beneath the surface for longer than he could guess. And for the first time since arriving, Daniel felt the weight of choice press against him with clarity, because following Rex had brought him here, but what came next would not be guided by instinct alone. It would require him to face something he had left behind, something that had been waiting patiently in silence, just beneath the surface. Daniel did not pull his hand away this time. Even as the faint pulse continued beneath his fingers, steady and measured like something that had learned patience over years, maybe decades, and he let himself feel it fully, not resisting the connection, not questioning it, because deep down he already understood that this was not something new entering his life. It was something old returning, something that had never truly left. And the realization did not come with fear, but with a quiet heaviness that settled into his chest as he shifted his weight and studied the seam more closely, his eyes tracing its path along the narrow strip of metal until it curved slightly and disappeared just beneath the surface of the water. And Rex moved again then, stepping closer with a low, controlled breath, his paw pressing gently against the ground near the edge as if marking the exact point Daniel needed to focus on. And Daniel followed that signal, adjusting his position until he was kneeling fully now, one knee in the damp soil, the other planted firmly as he leaned forward, his fingers pressing more deliberately along the seam, testing for any give, any response. And for a moment there was nothing, just the cold resistance of metal that had been still for far too long. But then, almost imperceptibly, something shifted, not a sound, not a movement visible to the eye, but a subtle change in tension beneath his hand, like a mechanism recognizing contact, and Daniel's breath slowed instinctively, his mind aligning with the rhythm of the pulse as he counted without thinking, the pattern repeating, precise, consistent, and familiar in a way that tightened his grip slightly. Because this was not random, it was engineered, designed to respond to timing, to recognition, and he adjusted his hand again, pressing down more firmly just as the next pulse reached its peak. And this time the reaction was undeniable. A faint vibration traveled along the metal strip, spreading outward in a controlled wave that disappeared beneath the water, and Rex lifted his head sharply, ears forward, body still, as if confirming the activation, and Daniel felt it then, not just beneath his hand, but through the ground itself, a subtle shift, like something deep below had awakened just enough to acknowledge his presence, and he sat back slightly, pulling his hand away as he watched the surface of the lake, waiting for some visible change, but the water remained still, unchanged, holding its silence as if nothing had happened at all, and yet the air felt different now, heavier, charged with something unseen, and Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering back to the metal strip as a memory surfaced more clearly than before, a briefing room, quiet voices explaining systems that would only respond under the right conditions, safeguards built into designs that were never meant to be discovered by chance. And he shook his head once, almost unconsciously, because this was not supposed to exist here, not in a place like this, not hidden beneath a lake that no one seemed to question. And Rex stepped back slightly, turning his head just enough to look at Daniel again, his expression not anxious, not uncertain, but expectant, as if the dog understood that the moment of discovery had already passed, and what remained was something deeper, something that required more than instinct to face. And Daniel placed his hand against his knee, grounding himself as he stared out across the water, the faint pulse still echoing somewhere beneath the surface, no longer distant, no longer hidden, but present in a way that could not be ignored. And for the first time since he had followed Rex down the trail, he realized that this was not just about what lay beneath the lake. It was about why it had responded to him. And that question lingered in the silence, unanswered but undeniable, waiting for him to decide whether he was ready to follow it further. Daniel remained kneeling at the edge of the lake long after the faint vibration beneath the metal strip faded into a quiet stillness again. But the silence no longer felt empty the way it had before, because now it carried structure, as if the entire shoreline had become part of something hidden and deliberate. And Rex stood beside him without moving, his gaze locked on the same point beneath the water as though waiting for permission that had not yet been given. And Daniel slowly exhaled, forcing his thoughts into order the way he had learned to do in moments where uncertainty could not be allowed to grow unchecked. And he shifted his weight back onto his heels, eyes scanning the shoreline once more, this time noticing details he had overlooked before, the faint alignment of stones along the waterline, the unnatural straightness of a submerged edge just below the surface, and the way the lake itself seemed slightly shallower in a narrow arc that curved outward like the outline of something engineered rather than formed by nature. And he stood slowly, boots pressing into the damp earth as he stepped back a few feet to widen his perspective, and Rex immediately adjusted with him, maintaining close proximity but no longer pulling, simply observing, and Daniel ran a hand through his hair as he looked out over the water again, the faint pulse still lingering in memory rather than sensation, steady and patient like something that had been waiting long before he arrived. And then he noticed it, a subtle change in the reflection of the sky on the lake's surface. Not movement from wind, but a faint distortion forming in a controlled line that extended outward from the shoreline into deeper water, and his expression tightened slightly as he focused, because the pattern was becoming clearer now, not random at all, but intentional, and he took a careful step forward until the water reached just above the edge of his boots, cold seeping through the material, and Rex let out a soft, controlled sound again, not alarmed but directive, as if confirming that Daniel was now positioned correctly, and Daniel hesitated only a moment before lowering his hand into the water once more, this time moving along the invisible path he had identified, following the submerged line outward, and as he did, the faint pulse returned, stronger than before, resonating through the water itself, rather than the metal strip, and he felt it travel up his arm with a subtle precision that made him pause mid-motion. And for the first time the lake responded not passively, but actively, the surface just ahead of him shifting almost imperceptibly, a section of water losing its uniform stillness, as if something beneath had adjusted its position, and Daniel stepped back immediately, eyes narrowing as he watched the area, because now there was no doubt left, something beneath the lake was not only present but aware of interaction, and Rex moved slightly ahead, placing himself at a slight angle between Daniel and the water as though taking a protective position while still focused on the same point. And Daniel felt a quiet tension settle in his chest, not fear, but recognition that whatever system lay beneath this lake had just acknowledged him in return, and as he stood there in the cold air, the shoreline no longer felt like an isolated place, but like an access point, a threshold, and the realization formed slowly but firmly in his mind that what he had been following was not just a signal from beneath the water, but an invitation that had finally found its recipient. Daniel stood motionless at the water's edge, the realization settling into him not as a sudden shock, but as a slow structural certainty, the kind that formed only when too many details aligned too precisely to be coincidence. And Rex remained just ahead of him, perfectly still now, no longer pulling or pressing forward, but watching the lake with a focus so steady it felt almost intentional, as if both of them had crossed an invisible line without fully stepping over it, and the air around them seemed to change in quality, quieter in a way that was not natural silence but controlled absence, like something had reduced the world down to only what was necessary for observation. And Daniel's eyes followed the faint distortion in the water again, now more stable, more defined, the subtle geometric irregularity beneath the surface forming into something that no longer resembled randomness but design. And he exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of old training rise in his thoughts without command, because recognition does not always arrive with clarity. Sometimes it arrives with structure, and what he was seeing now matched patterns he had not thought about in years, systems that responded only when pressure, timing, and proximity aligned in exact measure. And he took a cautious step closer, stopping just short of where the shoreline dropped into deeper water, and Rex shifted with him again, maintaining alignment, not leading anymore, but mirroring, as if the decision had already been transferred, and Daniel lowered his gaze to the surface, focusing on the exact point where the distortion seemed strongest, and as he did, the faint pulse returned, but this time it did not remain beneath the surface. It rose through the water in a barely visible ripple of tension, spreading outward in a controlled radius before settling again, and Daniel felt it not through touch this time, but through awareness, like the environment itself had registered his presence in a measurable way, and he narrowed his eyes slightly, scanning the shoreline and the water together as a single system rather than separate elements, and that was when he saw it, a subtle alignment between the submerged structure and the shoreline strip he had discovered earlier, forming a continuous boundary that extended further than he had first understood, and for the first time the scale of it shifted in his mind from isolated anomaly to engineered zone. Something placed here with purpose and maintained through time, and Rex let out a low, controlled breath, almost imperceptible, but enough to signal continuity rather than alarm. And Daniel nodded slightly without realizing it, because the realization was no longer abstract. It was physical, anchored in space and proportion, and the lake was no longer hiding something from him. It was holding something in place, waiting for the correct sequence to continue. And he understood then that what he had been following was not simply a trace or remnant, but a system still active, still responsive, and his presence had already been registered within it. And as he stood there in the cold air, everything around him felt like it had narrowed into a single question without words, not whether he had found something, but whether he had been meant to. Daniel did not move for a long moment, because the understanding forming inside him was no longer something he could step away from without acknowledging it. And the lake in front of him no longer felt like a natural body of water, but like a surface layered over intention, and Rex remained perfectly aligned beside him, still and focused, as if both of them were now standing inside a boundary that had already recognized their presence. And Daniel slowly inhaled, letting the cold air settle into his lungs as his eyes traced the faint distortions beneath the water once more. But now he was no longer searching for what was hidden. He was searching for what it meant, and that shift changed everything. Because meaning carried structure, and structure implied purpose, and purpose implied that none of this had happened by chance. And the silence around them deepened again, not with emptiness but with anticipation, as if the environment itself was waiting for a final confirmation. And Rex suddenly lifted his head slightly, ears angling forward with precise attention, not toward the water this time, but toward the shoreline behind them. And Daniel noticed the shift immediately, turning just enough to follow the dog's focus. And that was when he saw it, a faint line of movement along the edge of the lake. Not physical motion in the natural sense, but a controlled shift in reflection, as if the surface had been segmented into parts that were responding independently. And Daniel's expression tightened slightly as he recognized the implication. Because systems like this did not simply remain passive once engaged, they reacted, they acknowledged, and they transitioned. And he took a careful step back from the water without breaking eye line, his body adjusting instinctively to a position of observation rather than interaction. And Rex mirrored the movement again, staying close but no longer leading, simply present. And for several seconds nothing else happened, until the faint pulse beneath the lake returned once more, stronger now. Not just a rhythm, but a sequence, and Daniel felt it clearly through the ground beneath his boots, a structured pattern rising from below as if layers beneath the lake were aligning in response to something he had unknowingly triggered. And his breathing slowed as he counted without effort, recognizing that the sequence was not random but directional, progressing in a way that suggested initialization rather than repetition. And the shoreline ahead of them began to change in perception rather than form, the water appearing slightly darker in a precise arc that extended outward from the metal seam he had found earlier. And Daniel narrowed his eyes, because now it was no longer about discovery, it was about activation, and he felt something shift inside him at that realization, a quiet certainty forming that whatever lay beneath this lake had not simply been waiting to be found, it had been waiting to respond. And Rex took one small step forward, then stopped, holding position as if marking the threshold of what could and could not be crossed. And Daniel understood without words that they were no longer observing something hidden. They were standing at the edge of something that had begun to awaken. Daniel remained at the edge of the lake as the final shift in the environment unfolded slowly, not as an explosion of change, but as a controlled transition that felt almost deliberate. And the water in front of him began to behave in a way that no natural body of water should, not breaking or collapsing, but reorganizing itself in subtle layers of movement, as if something beneath the surface was adjusting alignment after recognizing a completed sequence. And Rex stood perfectly still beside him, his posture no longer alert in the sense of warning, but steady in the sense of confirmation. And Daniel felt that shift deeply, because it meant they were no longer outside of the system but inside its response field. And he took a slow step forward without thinking, drawn not by curiosity alone, but by the certainty that something was now unfolding specifically for him. And the faint pulse that had been beneath everything became clearer, rising through the air and ground in synchronized intervals. And for a moment the lake's surface darkened along the exact arc he had traced earlier, forming a precise boundary that separated ordinary water from something far more structured beneath it. And Daniel's breathing slowed as he watched the change continue. Because the distortion was no longer random or subtle, it was organizing into definition, and then without sound or disturbance. A section of the lake just beyond the shoreline began to shift downward slightly, not collapsing but lowering in a controlled and measured motion as if pressure beneath it had been released in a carefully engineered sequence, and Rex stepped forward one pace, then stopped again, holding position as if marking the limit of what was safe to approach, and Daniel understood that instinctively, but he did not step back, because what he was seeing was not danger, it was access, and the surface of the water continued to reorganize until a faint outline became visible beneath it. A geometric structure emerging through distortion rather than displacement, and Daniel narrowed his eyes, recognizing edges, symmetry, and alignment that confirmed design rather than accident. And the lake began to clear in a narrow vertical path, as though something beneath it had activated a controlled filtration or separation process, revealing a faintly illuminated structure below, not rising but revealing itself through layers of water that seemed to part in response to internal command. And Daniel felt a quiet pressure in his chest, not fear, but recognition reaching completion, because this system had not simply been discovered, it had been engaged, and now it was responding in full. And Rex let out a single soft breath, his attention fixed forward as the outline below the lake stabilized into a clear form, and Daniel realized that what lay beneath was not a forgotten structure, but an active one, maintained and waiting. And as the water continued to settle into its new configuration, a faint light began to glow from below the surface, steady and controlled, illuminating a boundary that suggested an entrance or threshold had finally been acknowledged. And Daniel stood there without moving, understanding now that everything he had followed, every pulse and distortion, had been leading to this exact moment of recognition. And as the glow stabilized and the lake grew still again in its new state, he understood with absolute clarity that he had not simply uncovered something hidden beneath the water, he had been answered.